To ask a question, please use the chat function, and myself as chair will then direct these questions to the speaker. And please ensure that you direct your questions to all participants. Again, a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and if you have any questions or concerns, please email globalfood@leeds.ac.uk. And also, I would like to encourage you to follow the Institute on social media to be aware of any future events. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if you're not familiar with the Global Food and Environment Institute, we are a cross-disciplinary institute at the University of Leeds. And the aim is to develop enduring solutions that bring about transformative change and to create a food system that is socially just, climate smart, and nutrition sensitive. We have 4 sub-themes, which are agriculture and environment, urban food systems, livelihoods in the global south, and international supply chains. We do hold regular webinars and other events, and we have a regular newsletter, so please keep an eye on that for future. Next slide, please. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Effie Papargyropoulou. She is a lecturer in sustainable food networks in the School of Earth and Environment, and is also the program leader for the new MSc Sustainable Food Systems, which will be launched in September. She is interested in the interactions between people and the environment, and to explore these interactions in the context of global environmental challenges. She has a particular focus on sustainability and sustainable development. So today she's going to talk to us about the future of surplus food redistribution, a topic that she has been researching over the last few years. So please, I hand over to Effie now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and good morning or good afternoon now, I think, to everyone. I'm really excited and very honoured to be invited to deliver this presentation today and talk about the future of surplus food redistribution in the UK. And here we go. I'm going to do this by presenting on a research project that we completed called Famished, which is about the interactions between food waste, surplus and hunger. It's a collaboration between 3 universities and 8 universities, and that's Newcastle, Sheffield and Leeds. And it has also been funded by the N8 Agri-Food thing, for which we're very grateful for. And in this project we engaged, it was very participatory project. We engaged heavily with organizations from the third, private and public sector, dealing with surplus food redistribution. So it's very much a challenge-led participatory project. So I'll go through the aim of the project, I'll explain what we did, what we found, and a little bit on what we think that means. But before I do that, first a little bit of context. So we have many problems in the food systems. I'm going to talk about 2 of them today. So on one hand, we have the problem of food waste. We waste about 1/3 of what we produce for human consumption. That in the UK accounts for about 10 megatons of food waste per year, and it has an economic value of £17 billion. And also it has big environmental impacts. I'm just mentioning here the climate change impacts. So it equates to about 20 megatons of CO2 equivalent in a year just in the UK. So these numbers, I'm just throwing them in there to show that it's a big problem, and it has implications both in the economy and the environment, and for the people as well. On the other hand, we have the problem of household food insecurity, and there we go. And We define this in this project as the inability to get enough nutritious food in a socially acceptable manner, or the uncertainty of knowing where your next meal might come to. And in the UK, we estimate that 20% of households are food insecure. That's 1 in 5, and I'll pause here. 1 in 5 households in the UK are food insecure, and that figure was before the pandemic. The pandemic obviously has made things worse, and we estimate that food insecure adults have quadrupled under the first lockdown, COVID lockdown. And also we estimate that about 90%, we saw a 90% increase in food bank usage between April 2019 and April 2020.
So food management.
This is a big problem. That's what I'm trying to show you. And COVID, obviously, and a crisis like the pandemic has made it even worse. So we have these two problems. Do we have one solution? And there is this thing called the Kyoto Agreement 2025. It's a voluntary agreement in the UK where it aims to reduce by 20% the amount of waste and carbon emissions associated with the food and drink sector in the UK for 10 years. So 2025 is the target year. And one of the ways that it suggests and promotes and how we can do that is through surplus food redistribution. And by that, we mean when we can capture surplus food before it becomes waste throughout the supply chain, but primarily usually at the retail level. So we capture that and we divert it to people affected by household food insecurity. And there has been a growth in surplus food redistribution in the UK, but just including this figure there, the 0.56 megatons, just to show you that it's still a small percentage of the overall food waste that we are talking about. Another trend that we've seen in this context is that we're moving away from what we call emergency food provision. So when we provide food for people and groups in crisis situations, refugees or asylum seekers coming here with nothing, or a whole area has been flooded, people have been displaced. So these are crisis situations, that's emergency food provision. So we're moving away from that to models addressing what we call routine household food insecurity. So that 20% of people, household affected by being food insecure, using surplus food redistribution as the main mean of getting the meals because they have no alternative. In this background, we developed Famished, which aims to set an agenda for surplus food redistribution in the UK for the next 5 to 10 years, including some interventions, practical steps on how we can get to that future. I won't go into a lot of detail on the methods that we employed, but just to give you a little bit of information on what we did and how we did it. So as I said, it's a project that we engaged heavily with organizations dealing with surplus food redistribution and related topics. There's a list of organizations on the right-hand side of the slide as an example. And initially we did some interviews, tried to understand a bit more about the motivations, the challenges and the opportunities. Then we had a couple of workshops with participants from across those groups where we did an explorative scenario building exercise, and I'll explain a little bit more how we did that later on, really to try to understand what do we want the future to look like? What do we want in the future in terms of surplus food redistribution? Here, just a little point to say that there's not one answer, obviously, to this question, and reaching consensus is a quite tricky thing to do. That's why through this processes, we try to do the best we can to reach a consensus and come up with an answer. And then we follow that with another exercise on a normative backcasting exercise, where we try to work out, okay, if this is the future of what we want to achieve, how do we get there? What are the steps to get to that point? So in terms of the findings, so motivations were misaligned. I would say that's the best way to describe it. On one hand, I would say the third sector organization primarily were concerned with alleviating food poverty and reducing food waste. And because it was the right thing to do, there was that moral imperative. unsurprisingly, the commercial sector were more interested in the business case. So doing that was saving them costs. So it was a cost-saving exercise, but also it was a good marketing PR exercise and part of their corporate social responsibility. There were many challenges. I'll just mention a few here. The third sector organization, especially the food charities receiving that surplus food, were struggling a lot with resourcing, and the reliance on volunteers. It's key here. That's a sector that is very volunteer based, and also investment, again, to invest in infrastructure of what they need to do the things they wanted to do, these charities. Logistics is a tricky one, again, to overcome. There are certain times when the food surplus is available for organizations to pick up, and then they need to store it. A lot of the time it needs cold storage before it becomes food waste, and then they can't use it themselves. So there are logistics at play there that are quite tricky, especially for smaller organizations. The retailers were particularly concerned about the legal requirements, especially when a food product had a brand on it. So, for example, they were concerned that if that product went on to be given to somebody and then it was beyond the sell-by date or the best by date, could have repercussions back to them. And something that was a challenge throughout, that we uncovered throughout our research project, was how to do about the power dynamics between the main actors in this sort of little microcosmos. And it was about the fact that the third sector organizations, especially the ones receiving the food surplus to deliver to people affected by food insecurity, were in what we call a dependent and subordinate position in relation to the retailers. They were the ones that determined when things become available, what sort of surplus food is going to be given to them, and that didn't give a lot of negotiating power to the third sector organizations. Saying that, it wasn't just challenges, there are opportunities. The retailers thought that overall quota was a good thing, and there was support for mandatory standardized reporting across the sector, although there was caution about surplus food redistribution infrastructure investments. So because there was a bit of an uncertainty whether the direction that the government is pushing for at the moment is going to continue like that, and whether there will be enough surplus food in the future to support that investment. In terms of the charities, they saw that as an opportunity in the future, they wanted to develop more what they call the non-food operations. So if we take the example of a cafe, which takes surplus food and makes meals, alongside that, a lot of the time they have other non-food operations going on. So this could be community pantries or lunch clubs or school programs or cooking workshops, or even advice services for employment or homelessness and things like that. And they saw that that was the way that they could contribute the best way in the future, and having the food as a means to bring everybody together, but not as a necessity because people cannot get food elsewhere. So that's about the current situation. What about the future? And as I said before, to do that, to understand what we would like the future to look like, we did this explorative scenario building exercise. And what we did is we employed this scenario access technique, where we take two variables. And in this case, we have the variable of the availability of surplus food and the levels of household food security. And we plot them against two vertical axes, and that helps us produce 4 plausible future scenarios. And then what we did is we split our participants in the workshops into 4 groups, and we asked them to develop narratives around describing these future scenarios. And then also we asked them which one we would like to happen in the future. And with the help of this brilliantly talented artist, Mary Talentai, we also developed these illustrations that act as visual summaries, and I'm going to show them to you now. So the first scenario is the one where we have a lot of surplus food, and low levels of household food security. So we have to imagine the future. How would that future look like? And we call it a lose-lose scenario because there's not a lot of good things happening in that scenario, unfortunately. So in this future, we rely on food overproduction. So it's a system that produces a lot of waste, and that's really bad for the environment. You can see the earth there being on fire. It's a very capitalist model, prioritizing profit maximization and growth. And that is coupled with low levels of household food security. And in that case, the third sector has picked up the pieces and is trying to use surplus food redistribution to address both the food waste and the household food insecurity. And we thought that this was the most likely scenario to happen if the current trends continued as they stand now. In the second scenario, we have still high levels of food surplus, but also on the other hand, we have household food security, which is a good thing. And we call this scenario a complacency scenario, because although we have addressed the root causes of household food insecurity, we still have that system of overproduction, food overproduction leading to low food waste and bad environmental impacts. But because the fundamental needs, the basic needs of the people are met, as you see this lovely gentleman is snoozing, having had a lovely meal, very balanced, fantastic, there's not really the motivation to do something to address the environmental impacts of that system until we think there would have been, we envisaged a tipping point where the environmental destruction that this system causes comes back and haunts us and actually threatens food security. For example, climate change, making arable land into not being able to produce food. And at that point, things might change. The third scenario is one where we have low levels of household food security and low surplus food. And we call this a food dystopia scenario. It's not a good scenario either. And it's because on one hand, in this scenario, we have the regulatory pressure against food overproduction. So we don't have a lot of food waste and we don't have a lot of surplus food, which is good for the environment, but we haven't addressed food insecurity. So we see that the mother not eating, skipping a meal so that the child can have a meal. And because there's not a lot of surplus food to go around, the demand for surplus food redistribution to cover that food insecurity has exceeded the supply. And that's where we see the fighting at the background in the supermarket. And this is a possibly volatile scenario that could lead to extremes. And it shows us how fragile and how problematic it is to rely on surplus food redistribution to address household food insecurity. And if you have been a little bit depressed by the three first scenarios, don't worry, I left the best for last. So that's a good scenario, that's a more positive scenario. So that's the one where we have household food security, high levels of household food security, and we also have low surplus food. So we have addressed the root causes of food insecurity, poverty, inequality, and we have this happy family enjoying a very nice balanced meal. But we also have addressed the system of overproduction that leads to food waste. So we have a happy earth there as well. And also the people alongside the supply chain, the workers in that food system are being paid decent wages, and we have a happy farmer there. Everybody's happy, obviously. And that's why we call this the food utopia scenario. And it's a scenario of a truly sustainable food system that delivers food security and delivers socio-economic benefits, but it does that within planetary boundaries. And when we asked our participants, this was we reached the consensus that was the most preferable scenario for the future. So taking you from that to some high-level findings. So we saw that surplus food redistribution paradoxically reinforced and perpetuates the problems that it tries to solve. And it does that because it distracts from addressing the root causes for both those issues, and also it shifts responsibility The responsibility at the moment falls on the third sector to address these two issues, and that's not right. And it's problematic, it's fragile, as we saw in the scenario building exercise. The fundamental cause for food waste is that we have a systematic food overproduction, and household food insecurity is rooted in poverty and inequality. Neither of those can be addressed by surplus food redistribution. That's not what it was set up to do, and it can't do that. So what does that mean for, and I'm looking at the time, good, what does that mean for policy? How can we get to that future that we want to achieve? So first we need to reject this win-win, we call it a win-win narrative around surplus food distribution that we are seeing at the moment, where is presented as a magic solution to these two problems. It is not. And further investment into surplus food redistribution risks further entrenching this two-tier unjust food system that is not resilient and it doesn't deliver food security. Then we need to tackle that systematic food overproduction. That food waste, that food surplus didn't just happen. There's a systematic thing happening here. And we need to tackle the cultural, regulatory, material and economic reliance on this unsustainable overproduction. There's some wonderful work being done, and I would like to look into more detail on that, on how we can do that. In terms of household food insecurity, well, we need to eradicate poverty, really, food poverty, as otherwise it's been called, and I have deliberately avoided calling it like that because I don't think that's a correct term. But even so, food poverty is not a food issue, it's a poverty issue. These, cannot be solved by just food-related strategies. We need to aim for food security, and we need, by food security, I don't just mean enough food to people, we need the right sort of food, we need healthy diets, and we need to do that within planetary boundaries. And that could be a truly sustainable food system. And finally, we need to rebalance the power dynamics between the food system actors. Across that food system, there are actors, and we're seeing that more and more the power is consolidated in fewer actors, and that actually skews the results that food system delivers, because, well, these actors are not there to deliver social or health outcomes. They're there to make money, the private businesses. So we need to rebalance that. We need better governance, and we also need the people alongside, the workers alongside that system to be given more power. So to conclude, the future of surplus food lies in an ideal scenario where we don't need surplus food redistribution, because we have addressed food waste and household food insecurity. And that what we call the true win-win scenario is that of a sustainable food system that delivers household food security, where we have the nutritious food that's available, affordable, and accessible by all at all times, and that is produced and consumed while respecting planetary boundaries. So it's a scenario where we put people and planet first before profit. And this food utopia, this is the fourth scenario we explored, can be achieved by addressing the root causes of food waste and household food insecurity as two separate issues as they are. So with that, I would like to thank you. And before we open to questions, to mention that what I just presented is a paper that is under review in food policy, so hopefully you can have the full manuscript soon. And if you have any more questions, I'll be happy to engage with you. This is my email. And now I think I'll hand over to Caroline, who's going to chair the Q&A questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Effie, for this very interesting and asking us to challenge some of our views on these problems. So we have a number of questions from the audience. The first one from Gulbano Captain about where the reference comes from and the date for the food insecurity percentage, so 20% of UK households being food insecure. When was the census for that date, for that data, if you like, and where is it published?
Yeah, so I was meant to show you this as well. There you go, Gildan. So the references are there. So the one about the 20%, I think it was from the for the Fuller et al. The food and use survey. It was the fifth wave. But also there's the House of Commons 6. So if you follow the references, they are right at the end of the presentation, which obviously I forgot to show.
Sure, thank you very much. And I think that there was going to be a new question on food insecurity in the census, but actually it was a subgroup that was asked that question, not the general population. So it's quite interesting, and some new data might emerge on food insecurity at a national level.
Yes, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Data is problematic, and also how we measure food insecurity is problematic because there are different models, and there is the US sort of type of question, and how we incorporate that in our own census, and is a quite tricky thing to put a number on. So these are just figures to show us the scale, really, rather than being very it can be interpreted in different ways, but it shows a big scale of the problem, and also how it changes and it moves towards the wrong direction, unfortunately.
Thank you. So another question about whether you took into consideration the interaction between food insecurity and food waste. For example, I've seen during the pandemic, financial problems was a driver for a reduction in food waste. And whether that's a trend that maybe it's a positive, I suppose, from a food waste and from a food waste perspective, I guess.
Yes. The actual research project and the interaction with the participants happened before the COVID, and I should mention that. So what we see here is even before the pandemic, and yes, it's really interesting to see some of the trends that we're observing, that not only because of the financial situation that has, as a result of the pandemic, that people are a little bit more careful about their food, and there are these reports and research coming out that shows that people were wasting less at the household, which is really promising, and it would be really interesting to see whether these trends continue after the pandemic. And also I think it might have something to do with the fact that people were in their houses a lot more, and they had a lot more time to confront with the reality of their food waste. And judging from my example, I kept eating all the leftovers. So there you go, from the night before for my lunch. So not that I'm representative of everyone, but in this research, because it was done before COVID, we didn't even know what was about to hit us. So we didn't take into account that particular example. But yes, that's really important to consider.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Vicky, who says, that there are people lucky enough to have access to these local surplus food redistribution organizations, but it's not available everywhere. And while she or he agrees that it's not a solution for the long term, it can make quite, can bring benefits in the short term. So the question is whether you think, what can be done to encourage these surplus organizations or networks in areas that don't have that, and how that, especially the sufficient workforce, can be organized in times of need, whether you had any insights on that.
Yeah, I think just to mention first that I'm not against surplus food redistribution. I think we have seen that it has, and those localized, the smaller sort of responses have been, especially during COVID, whether the ones that really proved more resilient and increased the resilience of our food system more than anything else. We saw when the bigger sort of infrastructure around food was failing, the smaller localized community-based initiatives were the ones that were prepping people up. And I do think there is a huge need for surplus food redistribution as even as a plaster at the moment of a big food insecurity issue that we're facing, that it needs to stay on until we reach a point in the future where there's no food insecurity. in the meantime, it is very important. They provide a hugely beneficial service. The critique here is about how that is being used and in a little bit manipulated to avoid responsibility in other parts of society, which the third sector, shouldn't be picking up all these big issues to solve. These are issues, systematic issues, and they should be addressed as such. So I feel it's unfair for the burden. And again, there's no resourcing. So to go back to the actual question, yes, there's still we still have pockets of areas, and the most hardest hit areas might not have the benefit of something like that, or even the other way around. Some of the most vulnerable people can get to, even if there is a cafe, even if there is a surplus food redistribution or a food bank around. So that is problematic, and that's why I think that needs to be considered as a national issue that governments need to take responsibility for. And I know I'm getting political now, but it is unfortunately a political issue. That's why I'm talking about power and those other things that I didn't go researching about, but they came up and they're very important. So I don't have a magic answer, I'm afraid, to this question, other than it needs to be part of a very well planned food provision system to avoid having pockets of very deprived areas or individuals that are left vulnerable to food insecurity.
Yes, and I agree with you, Effie, and I think that in certain places there is some level of coordination of these providers, but in some places there isn't, and so I think providing good examples that perhaps can be adopted across multiple places could be another approach. There is an interesting question from Joe, who runs a social enterprise in Sheffield and has worked with Surplus Food Redistribution for 6 years, and agrees that the power dynamic is a big issue with large food retailers expecting volunteers to collect food at particular times when it suits them, I guess. So did you work with retailers during your famished project, and any insights as to they are willing to adapt their practices to facilitate the surplus food redistribution?
Yes, we did. I mean, retailers are a big player in this, and although we are quite critical about the role in this, it's this is a discussion that needs to involve everyone. So yes, we did, both in the interviews and in the workshop. We had participation and contribution from them. Their response would be, and I don't know if there are any retailers on the call, and maybe they could come forward. And again, another thing that just to mention, when we're talking about these stakeholder groups, not everybody, they're not homogeneous, not everybody thinks the same way. And the same goes with this massive generalization I make about the third sector. It's huge variation and huge difference in priorities and interest, etc. But if we were to generalize, I think the response is that the surplus food redistribution that needs to happen, it needs to fit in with their commercial operations, not the other way around. For retailers, the response was, well, these are operations and this is something a little bit extra that needs to fit in. And they have the logistical sort of timing issues of, well, I can't let this become food surplus, can't give it away before I reached that point where it cannot be sold. Saying that, there was a retailer in our interviews that was actually taking action on that, and it was what they were doing is they were giving away the surplus food, or they were opening it up for whoever wanted to come and collect it 2 hours before closing time, to allow for a little bit more flexibility on who can take it and maximize that. But there were a special type of retailer, let's call it that. Obviously, I can't say names, but there are also, I think in private organizations, it depends what the priority of that organization is, and the ethos and the scale, and yeah, so it varies.
Yeah, and maybe following on from that question, do you think that it's overproduction or oversupply? Because there are reports, for example, that we don't produce enough fruits and vegetables, but yet they are the most wasted category. So there is a kind of contradiction in some of the terminology. And I wonder if you have a view about should we produce less fruits and vegetables then, or perhaps clarify that? Yeah.
Absolutely not. And thank you for bringing that up. So we definitely need, that's why I keep squeezing in healthy diets whenever I can in every slide, because it's not just about how much we produce, it's what type we produce. And we definitely need better investment on how, first of all, to produce the right sort of foods. If we start with a healthy diet and what that is, and work backwards from that on what we need to produce. And I agree, we don't produce a lot of the nutrient-rich stuff that we need to consume to be a healthy population. On the other hand, these are the ones that are the most perishable. So that's where we need the infrastructure. That's when we need the investment to make sure that when we have the fruit and vegetable from the farmer and goes to the consumer, and then how the consumer deals with it too, so that they don't get wasted. Because unfortunately, a pack of crisps lasts a lot longer than a tomato. So that is where we need to put our priorities. But definitely, it's not just about more food or less food, it's about the right food as well. It's not just about the quantity. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from Cassie and a similar one from Avro, who comment on the role of people within households in closing the gap between poverty and food insecurity. It's a bit of a more sociological question about what you think citizens or households, what their role is in this equation. In this
so, in the role of in the problem of household food insecurity, right?
Yes. Yeah. So yes, I think it's a question, I guess, about perhaps insecurity and poverty and food are all linked together. But I think the question is more about what the household can do. And
I would say I would answer that by saying what the individuals, what we all can do. Although I move away and I'm very critical about individualizing responsibility in any of these issues that I mentioned here, I think the individual response to a lot of the problems that we're facing in sustainability, but that's where my departure point was, and that's where my interest is to say the individual needs to do something to address that. And a lot of the time we say, well, individuals have power in consumption, so what they buy and what they don't buy, and skewing things that way, that's how we change things. I would say that's a very small thing of what we could do. Individuals and household, I would say more philosophically, taking it to a higher level, not necessarily into the project, can have power on how to move things around the food system as food citizens. So what I mean by that is we need to move from being food consumers to being food citizens. And food citizens is a little bit more holistic. It's not just about I consume, I buy something, which makes me powerful or not powerful, depending on whether I have money or not, whether I have buying power, but it puts it back to equality. We are all citizens. We all have the right to the right sort of food and to food security. So I guess as individuals, what households could do, well, maybe put governments in place that promote socially minded policies and address these food issues. Yeah, that would be my response. Again, going very political today.
Sorry. Very, very good question. So I'm going to put two more questions to you, and then we'll wrap up. So one of them from Katie asking about maybe any regulatory changes that you think need to be put in place to move away from this lose-lose situation.
Yes, I think there are sort of regulatory responses to both issues that we could do. On one hand, is something that it is coming, I think is in the pipeline, about that mandatory food waste and food surplus reporting. And surprisingly, I thought that the retailers would be completely against that, but we saw that they were very supportive of it, because, or at least the ones that we talked to, because they saw that as a way of leveling sort of the playing field, and everybody needs to report in the same way. There won't be ways of manipulating the system to show, oh, we don't produce so much of this, or we put that in the anaerobic digestion and we report it like that. So that would be a good way of leveling the playing field. And in terms of household food insecurity, these are policies that really should tackle poverty and inequality. So we have seen this rise in the UK, and by the way, I'll just say a caveat, this is not my area of expertise, but through this research I have engaged with this area. We have seen that food insecurity at that level, at the household level, has increased in parallel with when we've seen welfare policies that are being adopted in the last sort of 10 to 20 years in the UK. We have seen a huge increase with everything that is happening with the universal credit changes, and that had led to a lot of people being unable to secure the right and enough food. So really the response there is about dealing with poverty and inequality, and then it's a lot easier to get people to eat the right food, I guess, when they are in that position, or eat secure the right food and the right amount of food.
Okay, so our last question comes from Megan, and it's more about, maybe from your personal point of view, what can we all do to prevent food waste? So one actionable thing we can do, the most impactful, you think?
Yeah, I think the most impactful, I wish I was, I started as a waste management sort of person, so I loved all these things. So, you know, eat your leftovers the next day and all that stuff. This is fantastic, and I'm not saying that people should not do that. But I think it goes beyond that, and it goes about the way that we connect with our food. And I think we are quite removed from our food, and maybe I'm projecting here my own views, but I think that's what the question is about. I think we're so removed from the food, on how it's produced, where it's produced, the true value of that food, because it has become a commodity, and understand why we need this big system that sells us food, because otherwise it would be really difficult to get to it. So I see the benefits, but the result, an unintended consequence of that, is that we are so removed from the food and understanding its value. And how many people have done so many things for that tomato to come to our table, instead of just, you know, just wasting it. I think connecting better with food and being closer to food and understanding where our food comes from, the people, acknowledging the people in that supply chain that have worked so hard, and they are sometimes one of the most impacted by food insecurity, which is crazy if you think about it, that they can't actually afford the food that they're in the process of producing and bringing to our shelves. But I'll bring it back to the other thing of, yeah, on a personal level, connect with our food better, connect with our communities better, and yeah, be citizens, food citizens, not food consumers, which I know they sound big logos, like again political sort of logos, but I think that's the way to approach it.
Thank you very much, Effie. That's a really good way to finish, and makes us all think about that. So there are some other questions, but I think in the interest of time, we will close the session for today. But we will direct those questions to you, Effie, and as we said, we have your contact details as well, if anybody wants to get in touch with Effie directly. So I want to thank you very much, Effie, for coming and presenting your research today and sharing your insights. I want to share the audience as well for being great at asking questions and engaging in this topic. And we hope to see you very soon at the next seminar. Thank you. And
thank you very much.
Good day. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.